Hi, my name is Chris Connelly. My background is in sports science, working with the athletics department at NC State University. This project is based around our project that is called Athlete 360, where we're trying to build a kind of comprehensive platform for gauging athlete wellness and performance and trying to get as much information as we can to try and aid our process in helping our athletes in this way. So our goal with this platform is to be able to collect data from different sources to try and help us gain information on what can be affecting our athletes on a daily basis in terms of being able to perform at their best. And there's many things that play into that, whether it's things that we can or can't control or measure. So our goal is to collect what we can collect, be able to do what we can with that data to get the most information possible that we can then relay back to our coaches and other staff to then help us gain the best kind of complete picture of how we can help our athletes through training and everything around the process of helping them be ready to perform at their best. And then in the end, how can we be able to get all that data into one place, analyze it, and then be able to give it back to coaches in an easily understandable, consumable way. So what are kind of the different parts that are going to play into this platform? We need to be able to bring this data in easily. We need to be able to run that data through our different processes and analyze that data, and then be able to spit it back out into some reports, all in as little effort as possible, so that when these coaches need to come and look at these reports, it doesn't take a lot of time to be able to do so. And then whoever's involved in the process of collecting this data and being able to get the data ready also does not have to spend a ton of time and effort to get the job done. And then once we have all these parts in place, having our way to log in to see this data, giving the people logging in to see the data only the permissions that they need and seeing the data that they need to see. And then also having a platform for our athletes to be able to see what we want them to see, and hopefully try and drive a little bit of buy-in and interest around the data that we do collect from them. And all in the end, the goal here is to be able to create more conversations around what information we are getting, how that can affect our ability to help these athletes on a daily basis, and just try and drive more efficient conversations and communication to better help each part of this system work as best as possible. So within our groups in the athletic department, who are all the different parts of the staff that we want to be able to service and help through this process? Well, these groups we'll call kind of our pack performance groups within the athletic department. So the big parts that play into this are the sports medicine staff, which is our athletic trainers, any physical therapists or doctors that are involved in the process of helping athletes when they may not be feeling at their best, or they may be returning from an injury to get back to their sport. Our sports nutrition staff that will help our athletes be able to make sure they're fueling right for their sport and being able to keep up with the demands of being able to recover from training and be ready when they do get to competitions. Our sports psychology staff that can help with any other support that they need based on any stress coming from things outside of their sport, which can be academic related. It can be more socially related to, boyfriend or girlfriend, family, other friends, anything like that. And then our sports administration staff, who is everyone kind of above these groups that, can now get a better idea of what are the kind of daily demands on each part of the staff, what their job is like, what the different things that they do to help play into how we can help these athletes be prepared. And then on top of these groups is the group that I would be working with, which is the strength and conditioning staff, which are involved with all of the training in the gym, the fitness on the field, collecting the type of data that we'll be looking at, and then being able to work with all the things more on the physical side with these athletes. So the main thing that we'll be focusing on in the slides today will be the women's basketball data. Here we are looking at the Catapult GPS devices. So these are going to be devices that they wear during each practice and game. It is indoors all the time, so we don't get the traditional kind of positional data that you'd expect with GPS, but we will be relying more on the accelerometer data And as we dive into a little bit more of these things, you can always feel free to ask me questions in the chat. During this talk, I'll be there to respond and give you any information you may need that you're curious about. So some of the more impactful variables that we'll be looking at here are going to be stuff like velocity. We'll be looking at jumps. We'll be looking at IMAs, which is basically high intensity movements or moments in time. And then training loads, basically how much work is getting done within that particular session. And we'll be looking at practices in games as well. So being able to see the differences of what a normal training day looks like versus what a full-on game looks like. So how does this system run from start to finish? In these pictures, you can kind of see the setup for the Catapult system. They have a little GPS device that you can see above that little bib tank top there. So they'll wear that device in the back of that bib. It'll sit on their upper back. Once they finish that session, that data will get uploaded to the Catapult cloud, where we can pull the data from there to then upload to the landing zone. And then from there, we can spray the data onto the HPCC Systems cluster, and then run all of our scripts to clean and process this data, set up the layouts, get all the correct data types set in place, and then do any of our further analysis where we'll be doing any aggregations or anything to be able to get any information that is not already inherently there in the raw data. And then from there, we can pull that data from the cluster into RealBI, which will be the web interface that we use to create the dashboards and report tabs, so we can get our different kind of end views that will be showing different staff and coaches of these teams to be able to give them the information that we're trying to get at. So some of these differences between what we've most recently been able to do with this platform compared to what we had done a couple of years in the past. We more recently have been using an Azure-based Kubernetes cluster on the newer cloud-based platform with HPCC Systems. So some of our underlying processes had to change a bit. So part of our scripting for how we uploaded this data into the landing zone, we had to set up an Azure file share to be able to set up that landing zone and have a place to connect to and upload to, since it doesn't exactly exist in the same way as it would with the bare metal cluster. Same way with how we could identify where that data is then being stored and being able to then take it from there and spray it into the cluster. We had to reference the source storage plane rather than a physical IP address. And then once we could get through that process and the data was sprayed onto the cluster, it was a lot more familiar in terms of how we could use our code to go through the rest of all of our data processing and everything. We did run into some issues at first with some of the configuration of the cluster that would cause some shutdowns and some issues of jobs not being able to complete. A lot of that had to just do with the configuration and how it was trying to use resources for certain jobs. So we were able to fix a lot of things. We haven't quite yet been able to run the entire platform from start to finish to getting that data into RealBI. So everything you see from the RealBI standpoint today will be actually run from a older bare metal cluster. But in terms of everything we were able to accomplish, it did seem that everything we were doing was a little bit more efficient and a lot more resource friendly in terms of how the jobs are able to run on the Kubernetes platform. So just as a quick view here of what the women's basketball GPS data looks like when we're processing it. Here are just some more kind of attention points here to see how some of the data that has to do a little bit more processing than some of the other variables. The name and date here, we had to change just a little bit from the layout of where it was coming in from. For instance, in some cases in the raw data, the name would have quotations around it, so we had to eliminate those. And then changing the format of the date. We also added in a ID number for each period so that we could eventually use this in a machine learning layout. And then underneath, you can see some of the other time-related variables had to be changed a little bit in terms of their layout as well. And then at the bottom, you can see some of the fields that we will eventually filter by for some of our analysis. So game day count refers to where a certain day falls in comparison to where the next game is. And then just a week number, year number, day number, and their athlete ID number. So some of the ways that we process to get this information, first, we're just laying out, sorting this data and getting it ready for being able to pull in some of these other fields. Underneath that, you can see us connecting to our athlete info file to gain our ID numbers for those athletes. And then next to that, on the right side, you can see us connecting to our date file to be able to pull in some of those other date-related fields, the week number, the day number, the game day count, and then creating our year values. And then for the drills underneath that, pulling in our drill file so that we could see all of our period IDs based on the drills that we have for each session. And then here is just another further view of how we could process some of the data based on getting some of our more aggregate type values. So here we're grouping up the data to get a more individual view. We're grouping it up based on each athlete so that we can then find our averages on our main variables here based on each athlete. And then on the side, you can just see the layout afterwards of what that sort of looks like. So once we've done all this work to get this data in, to lay out these fields, how can we actually make sense of this data? How are we actually going to use the information we've been trying to get to paint a clear picture for these coaches and other staff that would like to see this data? So again, we can filter by some of these fields to get a different view. We can look at by each date, by a particular week, if we want to look between years, how things may have differed. And if we want to look at different particular days, so if we know a day that falls 2 days before a game typically will look similar each time we do it, then we can compare each time we have that type of day and what may be similar, what may be different. We can look between practices and games, what those particular differences may look like, but also between different practices and different games to see, if we had one game and our strategy was X, and we wanted to employ a different strategy the next game, how does the data look different? How did our gameplay may have different? How can we decipher that through the data? When we want to look at our different views in time, do we want to look at one particular day? Do we want to look at a week? Do we want to look at that for an individual athlete, for a position, everyone that plays a particular position, or do we want to look at the team as a whole? And do we want to break down different drills, looking at different drills from a particular practice, or looking at one particular drill each time we've done it on different days and how it may be different and similar? All of these things we can start to break down and get different views from different lenses and different dimensions based on what questions we may get from the coaches based on what they want to see or what we might be curious of ourselves. So here is our first quick view of one of our reports in RealBI. This is a daily view based on a particular practice. And if we start to break down each part of it here, we can see those small boxes at the top will give us a quick team average view based on that session for these variables. So again, IMAs is more our high intensity movements and moments in time. So this will be anytime they start and stop, anytime they are bumping into other players, anytime that they may be landing from a jump, anything that can kind of jar that device a bit that they're wearing. Player load, again, being kind of their total amount of work done within that session. Jumps, again, being any time that they are leaving the ground and coming back down. Trimp is going to be more of our intensity type of view of player load. So it's more considered an impulse, where we're looking at the training load of that session, but also in comparison to how much time they are actively spending in that session. So if we then take a breakdown look of some of these graphs in there, this is just some of those small graphs you saw under that top row. Here we're looking at player load, and if you look at the bar as a whole, that will be that particular athlete's total player load for that session. But if you then look within that bar at the different colors, that will be giving you a breakdown look at each individual drill from that session and how much player load came from each drill. So not only can we see their full player load, but now we can start to see what player loads contributed the most during the session, which contributed the least, or from each drill, sorry, and see what drills were heaviest, what drills were lightest. Is this what we would expect? Is this typical for those drills when we see them on other days, and start to think of it in that way. On the side, we have another intensity type view of our player load, where we're just looking at how much player load these athletes are achieving per minute. This is definitely a good way to break down some of the drills, because then we can really get a view of how intense some of these drills are. Sometimes you'll get a lot of player load from a drill just because it's long. Sometimes you'll get a lot of player load because it's intense, because they're doing a lot of activity in a short amount of time. So we can get a better view of that sort of idea when we look at player load per minute. And here is a easy table view here to look at how some of these variables compare to normal. In this case, this would be a very normal type day, yellow being just a bit above normal for these particular athletes for that variable. If we saw any red, that would be far above normal, and green would be below normal. So in this case, it's a very typical day that we might expect. But other times, if we're seeing some other colors, then we have some other things that we may want to pay a little more attention to. So here is just a game report view here now, very similar to the daily report, but now we're looking at just game data from a particular game. At the top, we still have our team average view for these variables. And then underneath, we have our breakdown view, very similar again to the daily report, but here we are now breaking it down to each part of the game. So now on the left, we have a more team view, breaking down each part of the game. And then here we can actually see here the warm up for this game was actually the highest player load per part of the entire session, which may be pretty surprising, but we have to realize that oftentimes warm up is going to be pretty long, and they are going to be doing a lot of activity. It may not be very intense, but over the length of that whole warm up, a lot of activity will be done. They're doing a lot of running around, they're doing a lot of shooting, they're doing a lot of rebounding. So it does add up. Even though it is very high on player load, obviously it's not as intense as the game. So this view does give you an idea of the overall player load, not quite the intensity. So it does kind of surprise you at first, but it is important to sort of remember that sometimes the work does add up in a warm-up. So we do want to make sure that sometimes that doesn't get too high. But then on the right, we can see player load broken down to each period of the game for each athlete again. So now we can see total work for that athlete in the game, and then how much of that work came from each part of the game. Now here we have a little bit more of an individual view, and we can point out some of these bigger differences between individuals when we're looking at this week view here. So each data point is a different day in the week, and we have our different variables shown in each chart. But now we can see there's one athlete on the left, one athlete on the right, and they were in different situations on this particular day. One athlete played in the game, one athlete did not play in the game, and that led to significant differences here for that day for pretty much all of these variables here. So it's important to note when we do have these weekly views, or when we're looking at a team weekly view, we are going to have some of these differences that won't show up if we're looking at the whole team as a whole. But when we look at each individual athlete, we'll see some of these bigger differences. And then again, even if you look at the day that they next practiced after the game, the person who didn't play had a much harder practice than the person who did play. So it's always nice to look at these views and be able to make sure that we're not missing things like this. Even though it's sometimes things that should be pretty obvious, it's things that sometimes get overlooked if you're not looking into some other finer details. Because then when we look here at this weekly report, it's not the same exact dates, but again, there is a game within here, and it's a little bit harder to tell where that game might be if you're just looking at a couple different variables of the team as a whole. Then if we look across on the right, we can see each athlete based on their player load from each day in this week. It does get a little bit messy if we're looking at each athlete here, so you can click on their athlete ID numbers on the side to take some of them out of the graph for the moment and filter down to some athletes that may be more of interest, whether you want to look at just athletes that played in the game, just athletes that didn't play in the game, or maybe a mix of each, just to get whatever particular view we want to see at that moment in time, and be able to get more of that individual view, but also layered into our weekly view for the team. And then underneath that, again, it's player load, looking each day how much is coming from each drill that we see on that particular day. So we can see what drills are being able to give us the most player load on each of these days. Are they similar type drills? Are they different type drills? What may have been different on these different days that can contribute to those types of differences? But anything that can help us take a deeper look to find any information that may be important for us. Some of the next steps that we're looking to take with this data would be doing a cluster analysis with dbScan. So this would be giving us just an idea of how we can group up some of our different sets of drills, where some drills may fall, like if we have drills that we would expect to be higher in player load, or drills that may be higher for jumps, where those would fall compared to each other. What drills may tend to be high for player load, may not be high for other things, or what drills may be high in everything. We can see how those drills will get clustered up and start to understand what makes those drills similar, what makes those drills different from each other, so that when we go to look into some of these different drills and we get, let's say we get a plan for our practice for the day beforehand, we can start to understand, all right, well, here's the drills for this particular day. Compared to our historical data, what can we expect these drills to be high in, or what can we expect these drills to contribute based on these variables? And then how does that give us a view of what the expectation for this practice as a whole might be? How much player load might we be able to expect from this practice based on these drills? And then once the practice is done, how did that compare to what we may have expected based on the past? How might it have been different? And if it was different, why might it have been different? What could have caused those differences? So very interesting things that we can try and figure out by taking a deeper look into our drills, and a way that we can look to kind of further service not only the coaches, but also the athletes through the course of the season, to keep them prepared, keep them feeling good through the course of that season as they have to keep competing in more games. So thank you. Hopefully you found this talk interesting and found some nice information coming from each part of it. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. I'll have my information in the chat, so you can catch my email address there to be able to reach out with any questions. But thank you for attending this talk, and I hope you enjoyed it.